Nobody expected this. Not the staff at Windsor. Not the senior royals. Not even the people closest to Catherine who thought they knew exactly how she handled things behind closed doors. Because Catherine, the woman the world knows as calm, composed, graceful, always smiling, always dignified, apparently reached a breaking point that nobody saw coming. And when she did, the decision she made sent shockwaves through the entire royal household. A private conversation, a leaked recording, and a demand so dramatic that even people inside Buckingham Palace were left speechless. The story you're about to hear has been pieced together from multiple sources close to the royal family. Some of it has been reported in fragments. Some of it has barely made headlines. But when you put it all together, the full picture is something far more extraordinary than anything that's appeared in the tabloids. Because this isn't just a story about a ban. This is a story about years of tension finally boiling over. About loyalty being tested beyond its limits. About a woman who has spent her entire royal life doing everything right, finally saying enough is enough. And the most shocking part? The conversation that started all of this wasn't supposed to happen at all. So what exactly was said? Who was in that room? And why did Catherine feel she had no other choice? Stay with me, because this story goes much deeper than you think. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand why this moment happened, you need to understand the relationship between Catherine and Meghan from the very start. Because the version of their relationship that most people believe, the one built on magazine covers and royal wedding smiles, was never quite what it appeared to be. When Meghan Markle arrived in the royal family, everything changed. And that's not a criticism. That's just the truth. The royal family had operated in a very specific way for a very long time. There were rules. Unspoken ones mostly. About how you behaved in public. About what you said and what you never said. About how you handled the press, the cameras, the constant scrutiny. Catherine had learned all of those rules. She had spent years learning them before she even married William. She understood the game. She played it quietly and she played it brilliantly. Meghan came in with a completely different energy. And at first, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The public loved her. The press was fascinated by her. Harry was visibly happier than he had been in years. But behind the scenes, things were already complicated. Here's where everything changed. It wasn't the tiara story. It wasn't the bridesmaid dress argument. Those things happened, yes, but they weren't what truly fractured things between the two women. According to people who were close to both households during that period, the real tension began much earlier and ran much deeper than any single argument about flowers or fabric. The real issue was about trust. And more specifically, about information. Inside the royal family, information is everything. What gets shared, what gets kept private, who knows what and when. It's not paranoia. It's survival. Because in a world where every word can end up in a newspaper, in a book, or on a streaming platform watched by millions of people globally, you have to be extraordinarily careful about what you say to whom. Catherine understood this completely. It was almost second nature to her by the time Meghan arrived. And according to sources, Catherine became increasingly uncomfortable with the feeling that private conversations weren't staying private. Nothing was ever proven at that point. Nothing specific was pinned down. But the discomfort was there. And it grew. But what happened next surprised everyone. Because despite all of that, Catherine continued to be warm. Continued to make efforts. Continued to extend olive branches even when those around her were quietly pulling back. People close to Catherine say this is completely in character for her. She doesn't give up on people easily. She believes in family. She believes in working through conflict rather than walking away from it. She kept trying long after many others had stopped. And that makes what eventually happened even more significant. Because when someone like Catherine finally decides enough is enough, it means something. It means the situation reached a point that she simply could not ignore any longer. And that point came in the form of a conversation that was never supposed to leave the room it happened in. The details around exactly when and where this conversation took place have been deliberately kept vague by those who've spoken about it. Some sources suggest it happened during a brief window when Harry and Meghan were back in the United Kingdom. Others suggest it was connected to a specific royal event where both women were present in a more private setting than usual. What is consistent across every account is this. Something was said. Something significant. Something that, when it reached Catherine's ears, fundamentally changed how she felt about the situation. That's not even the biggest surprise. Because the conversation itself was only half the story. The other half was the fact that it leaked. That a private exchange, spoken behind closed doors, in what should have been one of the most secure and private environments in Britain, somehow made its way out. And the question of how that happened, and who was responsible, became almost as explosive as the content of the conversation itself. Think about what that means for a moment. Windsor Castle isn't a public building. It's not a restaurant or a hotel lobby where people can eavesdrop. Access is controlled. Staff are vetted. There are protocols around privacy that have been in place for decades. The idea that something said privately inside those walls could leak out is deeply unsettling to everyone in the royal household. Because if it happened once, it could happen again. And that realization changed everything. So why did the king really make this decision? Well, that question matters here because Catherine's reaction didn't happen in isolation. This wasn't just Catherine acting alone on emotion. What happened was far more considered, far more deliberate, and involved conversations at the highest level of the royal household. King Charles was made aware of the situation. That much appears to be certain. And while Charles has always maintained a complicated, painful, deeply personal hope that his family might one day find a way back together, even he apparently acknowledged that certain boundaries had been crossed. The word used in conversations around this situation, according to one source, was irreversible. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just quiet, calm, and final. Irreversible. And that word tells you everything about the gravity of what was decided. But here's the part almost nobody knows. Catherine's position wasn't just about the leaked conversation. That was the moment that crystallized everything. But the decision she pushed for, the idea of restricting Meghan's access to Windsor in particular, was rooted in something she had been thinking about for much longer. Windsor Castle is not just a building. People forget that sometimes because it looks like a postcard and it gets photographed so often that it almost becomes abstract. But Windsor is a home. It's where Catherine and William have built their family life. It's where their children grew up. It's where they retreat from the public pressure of royal duties and try to simply exist as a family. And Catherine's feeling, her deeply personal feeling, was that this home had been compromised. Not because of anything specific on a single occasion, but because of a cumulative pattern that she felt she could no longer dismiss or explain away. She wasn't angry. She was certain. And there's a very important difference between those two things. Anger fades. Certainty doesn't. And this is where the story becomes even more dramatic. Because while all of this was unfolding behind closed doors, the public had absolutely no idea. The cameras were still catching smiles at public events. The official statements were still warm and measured. The narrative being presented to the world was business as usual. But inside the walls of Windsor and inside the offices of Buckingham Palace, something enormous was being decided. Who would be told and when? How it would be managed? What it would mean for future events, future royal gatherings, future occasions where the family would typically be expected to appear together. Because the practical implications of what Catherine was asking for were enormous. If Meghan was to be restricted from Windsor specifically, what did that mean for coronations? For jubilees? For moments of national significance where the entire family is expected to gather? What did it mean for King Charles's own complicated feelings about his youngest son and his grandchildren on that side of the family? These weren't simple questions. And nobody had simple answers. Then something unexpected happened. Word of the situation, not the full details but enough to indicate that something serious was happening, began to filter through to people beyond the immediate inner circle. Royal correspondents started picking up fragments. Sources inside various households started getting nervous. The kind of careful, quiet whisper network that operates around the royal family at all times started buzzing in a way that people who work in that world describe as unusual. And Harry, according to people close to him, became aware that something had shifted. Not the specifics. Not the full picture. But the feeling. The temperature change. The subtle withdrawal that happens when a decision has been made and people are simply waiting for the right moment to make it formal. And Harry's response to that feeling was something that will be deeply familiar to anyone who has followed his journey over the past several years. He pushed back. Not quietly. Not through private channels. Not through the kind of careful, diplomatic back and forth that the royal family typically uses to manage internal conflict. He pushed back in a way that made everything more complicated. The details of exactly how he did that are still not fully public. But sources suggest that communications came from the Sussex side that were intended to challenge the narrative, to question the version of events that had reached palace officials, and to put forward an alternative account of what that private conversation had actually involved. And that response, whatever its content, only hardened the position of those inside Windsor. But here's where the real emotional weight of all of this becomes impossible to ignore. Because at the center of this entire situation are two women who were, at one point, genuinely trying to make something work. Whatever happened between them, whatever was said or leaked or misunderstood or deliberately distorted, there was a time when both of them were trying. People who knew Catherine well during those early years say she genuinely wanted Meghan to succeed. She understood better than almost anyone what it felt like to be scrutinized, to be criticized, to have every detail of your appearance and your choices pulled apart by the press and the public. She had lived through it herself for years before she ever became a royal. And people who knew Meghan during her early royal period say she was genuinely trying to find her place. That she was not indifferent to the institution she had married into. That she wanted to contribute, wanted to do meaningful work, wanted to build something real. So how did two women who were both trying end up here? That question is heartbreaking when you sit with it long enough. And the answer isn't simple. It never is with family conflict. It's never one thing. It's never one moment. It's the accumulation of small misunderstandings, of different expectations, of different ways of communicating, of different relationships with an institution that has its own enormous gravitational pull on everything around it. The royal family doesn't just change the people inside it. It shapes how those people see the world, how they handle conflict, how they define loyalty, what they believe they owe to an idea that is much bigger than any single person. Catherine was shaped by it in one direction. Meghan was shaped by it in another. And eventually those two directions pointed so far apart that no amount of olive branches could close the distance. And this is where the history matters. Because this kind of fracture is not new inside the Windsor family. It has happened before. More than once. More than twice. The history of the British royal family is filled with stories of insiders and outsiders, of people who adapted and people who couldn't, of relationships that broke under the pressure of an institution that demands conformity in ways that most ordinary families simply don't. Think about Wallis Simpson. Think about Princess Margaret. Think about Diana herself. Think about the long, painful history of people who entered the Windsor orbit and found themselves in conflict with something they couldn't quite name and couldn't quite defeat. The institution always wins. That's the brutal, honest truth of it. The institution always outlasts the individual. It bends, it adjusts, it modernizes at the edges, but at its core it remains what it has always been. And anyone who challenges that core, however justified their reasons might be, eventually finds themselves on the outside looking in. Harry and Meghan chose the outside. That was their decision. And whatever you think about that decision, it was theirs to make. But making that decision didn't end the consequences of it. And it didn't end the pain on either side. So why did Catherine's feelings about Windsor specifically become so central to all of this? Because Windsor represents something particular. It's not Buckingham Palace, which is essentially an office building dressed as a palace. Windsor is different. Windsor is ancient and personal and deeply tied to the private identity of the royal family in a way that no other royal residence quite matches. It's where the Queen spent her final years. It's where she's buried. It's where Charles retreats to feel close to his mother's memory. It's where William and Catherine are raising their children as quietly and as normally as royal life permits. For Catherine, protecting Windsor meant protecting something sacred. Something private. Something that the public gaze hadn't fully reached and that she was determined to keep that way. And she felt that had been threatened. Now here's where the confidential palace decisions come into the story. Because once Catherine made her feelings known, once those conversations happened at the highest level, there were decisions to be made about how to formalize any restrictions without creating an international incident. Without giving the press ammunition. Without making King Charles look like he was choosing sides in a family conflict that had already generated more headlines than anyone wanted. This is the part that required real political skill. And the people around Charles are very good at political skill. The approach, according to sources, was to make things feel administrative rather than personal. To frame any restrictions around security concerns, around protocols, around the logistical realities of managing royal residences, rather than around the personal request of a specific family member. It's an old palace trick. When you want to do something uncomfortable, you dress it up in procedure. You make it feel bureaucratic rather than emotional. You give the decision a language that allows everyone to maintain dignity on the surface while the reality underneath is something far more human and far more painful. And it works. It almost always works. Because nobody can argue with procedure. Nobody can publicly fight against a security protocol or a logistical guideline without looking unreasonable. But everyone involved knows what it really means. Then something shifted in a way that nobody predicted. Because around the same time that these internal decisions were being quietly managed, something happened in the public sphere that complicated everything. A series of stories began to emerge. Not about Windsor specifically, not about the leaked conversation directly, but stories that touched on the broader relationship between Harry and Meghan and the royal family in ways that suggested someone was talking to someone. The sourcing on these stories was vague. It always is. Royal journalism operates in a world of unnamed sources and carefully worded attributions. But the consistent thread running through the stories was a picture of a royal family that was not moving toward reconciliation. That was, in fact, moving in the opposite direction. And those stories landed differently because of what was happening privately. Because when you know there's a fire, smoke makes a lot more sense. Harry noticed. Of course he noticed. He's been watching the British press for his entire life and he understands exactly how the information ecosystem around the royal family operates. He knew what the stories meant even if he couldn't prove who was behind them. And his response, again, made things more complicated rather than less. But here's the part that truly stays with you when you think about this whole situation. Somewhere in the middle of all of this political maneuvering, all of this institutional calculation, all of this careful management of image and narrative and access, there are real people. There's Catherine, who has battled serious illness with extraordinary courage while simultaneously managing the weight of a future queen's responsibilities, who apparently reached a point where she felt she needed to draw a line simply to protect her family and her home. There's William, who loves his brother despite everything, who grew up sharing a bedroom with Harry, who stood beside him through the most devastating loss of their lives when their mother died, and who now finds himself on the opposite side of a divide that neither of them ever imagined. There's Harry, thousands of miles away in California, watching the country he grew up in have endless conversations about him and his wife, unable to control the narrative, unable to walk back into the institution he left, unable to fully leave it behind either. And there's Meghan, who came into this world as an outsider and who, fairly or unfairly, has become the focal point of a conflict that involves forces and histories and dynamics that were present long before she arrived. None of these are cartoon characters. None of them are simply villains or heroes. They're complicated people caught inside an impossible situation that was never going to resolve itself neatly. And then there are the children. Because that's the layer of this story that is hardest to sit with. George, Charlotte and Louis growing up inside Windsor Castle with the weight of an entire nation's expectations already beginning to settle on their small shoulders. And Archie and Lilibet, growing up in California, British by blood and American by life, with a complicated inheritance that they didn't choose and that nobody can fully explain to them yet. These children are cousins. They share grandparents. They share history. They share blood. And the decisions being made by the adults around them right now will shape what kind of relationship those children have with each other for the rest of their lives. That's the consequence that never makes the headlines but sits underneath every single part of this story. Now let's talk about what this means for the future. Because the situation as it currently stands is not stable. Nobody who understands the royal family believes that the current arrangement, whatever form it has taken, is permanent. History tells us that royal relationships shift. They thaw. They freeze again. They break and sometimes, unexpectedly, they begin to repair. But something feels different this time. The people who have been watching the royal family closely for decades, who have seen internal conflicts come and go, who have seen the institution absorb enormous shocks and quietly continue, say that the current situation has a quality to it that they don't recognize from previous family fractures. It's quieter. More settled. Less like a storm that needs to pass and more like a decision that has simply been accepted. And that quietness is perhaps the most telling thing of all. Because when royal family members are in conflict and there's still hope for resolution, there's usually noise. Competing stories. Back-channel communications. The subtle signals that both sides send through trusted intermediaries and friendly journalists, indicating that they're still engaged, still fighting, still trying to find a way through. That noise has mostly stopped. And in the world of the British royal family, silence means something very specific. It means someone has made peace with a situation they cannot change. The question is which side made that peace first. And what it cost them to get there. King Charles, by all accounts, hasn't given up. He never fully gives up on his children, however complicated the relationship has become. People who know him say that his love for Harry is real and runs deep, and that the estrangement causes him genuine pain in moments when he allows himself to feel it rather than simply manage it. But Charles is also a king now. He carries a responsibility that is bigger than any single family relationship. And he has learned, painfully, over a very long life, that the institution sometimes requires you to set aside what you want personally in favor of what the crown needs institutionally. It's a lesson that has cost him dearly before, and it appears to be costing him again now. And what about Catherine? Here's the final piece of this story that is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary of all. Catherine, throughout all of this, has continued to do something remarkable. She has continued to show up. Despite her health challenges. Despite the internal pressures of her family's position. Despite the weight of knowing that she is, in many people's eyes, the future of the monarchy in its most human form. She has continued to appear. To smile. To carry out her duties with the kind of quiet dedication that makes headlines feel almost inadequate to describe it. And in doing so, she has drawn a very clear line between two different approaches to royal life. One approach says that the institution is a cage and that authenticity requires breaking free of it. The other approach says that the institution is a responsibility and that dignity requires honoring it, even when it's painful, even when it's unfair, even when everything inside you wants to walk away. Catherine chose the second approach. She's been choosing it her whole adult life. And the decision she apparently made about Windsor, however it was packaged, however it was managed, however it was dressed in the language of procedure and protocol, was ultimately an extension of that same core belief. This is my home. This is my family's home. And I will protect it. Whether that decision was right or wrong, whether it will be remembered as an act of strength or an act of something more complicated, only time will tell. But one thing is certain. The relationship between these two parts of the royal family has changed in a way that can't be undone simply by a photograph at a public event or a carefully worded joint statement. Something happened. Something real. Something that people inside that world felt profoundly enough that it filtered out despite every effort to contain it. And somewhere in California, in a house a very long way from Windsor Castle, a man who grew up in that castle is living with the knowledge that a door has closed. Maybe not forever. But for now. And sometimes for now is the thing that matters most. The story of the British royal family has always been a story about what we're willing to sacrifice for the things we believe in. For duty. For love. For family. For freedom. For the idea of something bigger than ourselves. Every person in this story has sacrificed something. The question that nobody can answer yet is whether any of those sacrifices were worth it. And whether the people who made them will ever really know.